At a certain point, I realized that all the sounds around us had ceased. I couldn't even hear the crickets anymore. Everything was shrouded in an overwhelming silence. It was strange, but the most horrifying part was yet to happen as I began to hear a loud cry, accompanied by a long, horrible, and eerie wail. It seemed like the cry of a woman. Grim Secrets, good evening. Grim Secrets community. My name is Gabriel Remigio. I have thought long and hard about writing to share my experience with you. What I lived through was so horrifying that many times I've preferred to keep it to myself. There was a fear within me that no one would believe me, making the whole ordeal even scarier. However, after so much time listening to your show and hearing others share their stories, I've decided to follow their example. I work painting the white and yellow lines on highways. I have a colleague with whom I always carry out this work. One day, we were called to paint a highway in the state of Morelos. We came to an agreement and signed the contract. Looking back, I wish I had never taken that job. If I could go back in time, I would never have signed that paper. The job in Morelos, Monday arrived, and we headed toward the assigned area to carry out our work. As we traveled in my truck, my colleague mentioned that the night before, he had heard an eerie wail echoing through the streets of his neighborhood. By the time the sun came up, all the neighbors were talking about it, all agreeing that it must have been La Llorona. I asked him if he had been scared, and he replied that he wasn't, as it wasn't the first time he had heard it. He told me that as a child, he had already witnessed the terrifying cry. Honestly, I didn't believe him much, but I didn't insist. We continued our journey, discussing other topics. 3:58, I knew we had been sent to a rural area, but I didn't imagine it would be so desolate. For miles, we didn't pass a single house along the road. It felt like we were in the middle of nowhere. The highway we were to paint wasn't entirely new. It had previously been a dirt road, which had been restored and paved. The road was completely closed to traffic, so we would be working alone in that section. In some ways, this was good, as we would work more peacefully. But on the other hand, it made us feel truly isolated from the world. The isolation deepens. We finally arrived at the intersection where the new pavement began. We stopped, prepared everything, unloaded the equipment, adjusted the necessary tools, and got to work. The day passed without incident, and by nightfall, we headed to the nearest hotel. It was located about 15 minutes away from where we started working. The next 2 days were similarly uneventful. As I mentioned earlier, the road was still closed to traffic, so there was no one else but the two of us. The workers installing the signs had finished and left, making us the only ones working there for the past few days. As we progressed in our work, we moved further away from the town where we were staying, meaning the hotel was becoming increasingly distant. By the third night, we were bringing all our belongings in the truck because going back and forth to the hotel was taking hours. It was a waste of time, money, and gas. Deciding to stay, there wasn't any nearby town on the other end of the highway either, so the most viable option was to sleep in the truck by the road. After all, no one passed through there. In a way, that made us feel safe. We had prepared in advance with food and water. As the sun began to set, we started putting away our tools, and before we knew it, night had fallen completely, leaving us enveloped in darkness on that lonely highway, miles away from anyone. Both of us began to feel nervous. The darkness was much deeper than we had anticipated, making everything seem truly terrifying. Now more than ever, we felt vulnerable. The cold air was biting, so we got into the truck and closed the windows. We ate, talked for a bit, and then reclined the seats to sleep. Though it wasn't comfortable, exhaustion took over, and I quickly fell asleep. The night's strange occurrence. A few hours later, I woke up needing to relieve myself. I checked the time, It was a little past 3 a.m. I got out of the truck and walked a few meters toward a tree. Everything was calm, with only the sound of a few crickets. Once I finished, I turned to walk back to the truck. As I walked back, I noticed something strange. About 100 meters away, I saw a woman dressed in white walking down the middle of the road, heading in the opposite direction from us. It struck me that she must have passed very close to us minutes earlier. Startled and frightened, I watched as she moved. The road was dark, but her white dress made her stand out in a terrifying way. I couldn't understand what she was doing there, alone in the darkness. Then, right in front of my eyes, she vanished. She didn't disappear into the distance or out of view. She just vanished as if she were a ghost. Fear overwhelmed me, and I ran back to the truck. My colleague was still asleep. I didn't know whether to wake him or tell him what had happened, but I figured it wouldn't make a difference. Starting the truck and leaving wouldn't change anything. We were too far from the nearest town, and given how nervous I was likely to cause an accident. The cry of La Llorona. Minutes passed, and the more I thought about it, the more terrified I became. Had I just seen a ghost? It felt so cold that it seemed to seep into my bones, and the fear made my hands tremble. Suddenly, the sounds around us stopped. There wasn't even the sound of crickets. The silence was deafening. Then, the most horrifying thing happened. I began to hear a loud, eerie cry. It was a long, bone-chilling wail, sounding like it came from a woman. The wail grew louder, echoing in my head and piercing my bones. The hair on my arm stood on end. At that moment, I remembered what my colleague had told me and started to connect the dots. Could this be the same woman I had just seen disappear in the darkness? I was terrified, yet my colleague slept soundly, seemingly unaware of what was happening. Seconds passed, and the cry was now just meters away. I was lying in my seat, fully reclined. I didn't dare sit up because I knew that if I did, I would likely see that woman outside the window, and I couldn't bear the thought. A desperate escape. I couldn't take it any longer. I sat up, turned on the truck, and sped off toward the town where we had been staying. My colleague woke up, startled. "What are you doing?" he asked. "Didn't you hear it?" I replied, my voice trembling. It was a night like any other. The sun had set, and the evening sky was heavy with the weight of silence. The kind of silence that grips you in an eerie embrace, leaving you unsure of what might lurk just beyond your sight. Gabriel Remigio, a seasoned highway line painter, was no stranger to lonely roads and desolate places. But on that night, as he and his companion set out to complete a job painting the lines on a newly paved highway in Morelos, something far more sinister than silence awaited them. The highway had been closed for maintenance, which meant Gabriel and his partner were alone, completely isolated for miles on end. The remoteness was unsettling, but they had a job to do. Days had passed without incident, but by the third night, circumstances had forced them to sleep in their truck near the worksite. Going back and forth from the hotel had become impractical, and with no other towns nearby, they made the decision to stay close to the highway. As the sun dipped below the horizon, they packed away their tools, ate dinner, and reclined in their seats, ready for a night of rest. The darkness outside was dense, more impenetrable than usual, and both men found themselves feeling unusually on edge. Gabriel closed his eyes and, despite the discomfort, fell asleep to the sounds of crickets in the distance. It wasn't long before Gabriel awoke in the dead of night, feeling the urge to relieve himself. He glanced at his watch. It was just after 3 a.m. Without thinking much of it, he stepped out of the truck and walked a short distance toward a nearby tree. The air was cold, unusually cold for that time of year, and as Gabriel finished, he noticed something out of the corner of his eye. About 100 meters down the highway, there was a figure, a woman, dressed in a flowing white gown, slowly walking away from him. Gabriel froze. His mind raced with questions. Who was she? What was she doing out here, alone, in the middle of the night? The highway was pitch black, yet her white dress glowed faintly in the darkness, almost as if illuminated by some unnatural light. He stared at her, too shocked to move. Then, before his eyes, she vanished. Not gradually, like someone fading into the distance, but instantaneously, as if she had been swallowed by the night itself. Gabriel's heart raced. His pulse quickened, and a cold sweat dripped down his back. He knew what he had just seen wasn't normal. He sprinted back to the truck, his breath ragged and shallow. Inside, his companion was still asleep, completely oblivious to the horror that Gabriel had just witnessed. He debated whether or not to wake him, but fear paralyzed him. What if that woman returned? What if she was something inhuman? Minutes passed in agonizing silence, but Gabriel's terror only grew. The night had grown even colder, and his hands trembled as he gripped the steering wheel. Every now and then, he would glance behind him, expecting to see the woman standing there, watching him through the window. And then, the sound came. A long, mournful wail pierced the night, a cry so chilling it seemed to shake the very air around him. It was the unmistakable sound of a woman's sobs, a voice filled with unimaginable sorrow and pain. Gabriel's body stiffened. His grandmother had often warned him about La Llorona, the ghostly woman said to wander the night in search of her lost children, wailing in torment as she drifted through towns and across lonely roads. He had always thought it was just a legend, a scary story to keep children from wandering too far from home. But now, that terrifying wail was echoing all around him. He remembered his grandmother's words. If you hear La Llorona's cries up close, it means she's far away. But if her wails seem distant, it means she's near. The chilling truth of those words hit him like a sledgehammer. The wails grew louder, closer, until it felt as if they were coming from right beside the truck. He could feel her presence, the air around him growing colder with each passing second. Panic consumed him. He couldn't bear the thought of seeing her again, not so close. He tried to calm himself, telling himself to stay strong, but every sound, every shadow seemed to play tricks on his mind. His companion slept soundly, still unaware of the terror surrounding them. Gabriel could no longer endure it. He started the engine, the roar of the truck's motor breaking the silence, and floored the accelerator. The tires screeched as he sped down the highway, his companion jolting awake in a panic. "What's going on? What's wrong?" his partner asked, confused and groggy. "La Llorona," Gabriel gasped. "I saw her. I heard her. We need to get out of here." Now, his partner tried to calm him down, urging him to pull over before they crashed. But Gabriel's terror overpowered his reason. He drove recklessly, desperate to escape, until finally, they reached the town where their hotel was located. That night, sleep was impossible. Gabriel lay in bed, recounting the encounter over and over in his mind, unable to shake the haunting image of the woman in white. His partner, though skeptical at first, listened carefully and admitted that the cries Gabriel had described matched the eerie wails he had heard before they took the job in Morelos. They agreed to finish their work as quickly as possible and never return to that highway. For the next 2 days, they worked tirelessly, finishing just before sunset on the final day. As they rested, a local farmer happened to walk by and struck up a conversation. Gabriel, still unnerved by his experience, cautiously asked if strange things happened around there at night. The farmer smiled knowingly. So you've heard her," he said. "La Llorona. She's been heard often in these parts lately. Folks around here know to stay away from these roads after dark." Gabriel's blood ran cold. The farmer confirmed his worst fears. La Llorona's cries had been haunting the area for weeks, and many had seen her wandering these lonely roads. Though they had completed their job, Gabriel vowed never to return to Morelos. No amount of money could convince him to relive that night of terror. The cries of La Llorona had etched themselves into his soul, a reminder that some legends are far more real than we could ever imagine. Years later, Gabriel still refuses any job offer that takes him near Morelos. The memory of that night haunts him, her cries still echo in his dreams, a ghostly reminder of an encounter he will never forget. As for La Llorona, her mournful wails continue to drift across the desolate roads of Mexico, a tragic spirit forever searching, forever crying, and forever feared. And so, another mystery fades into the shadows. If you enjoyed the story and want to keep uncovering the darkest and most chilling secrets, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. This was Grim Secrets, where untold stories come to life. Until next time, and remember, not everything is as it seems in the dark.